Well, Thomas, ready to sign those surrender papers and get off my lake?
That's what this HOA president said as she barged into my home office, clipboard in hand, thinking she'd finally won our 6-month war. What she didn't expect was finding me in a meeting with someone in a crisp navy suit, briefcase open, documents spread across my desk. I watched her smug smile falter as the man looked up with steel gray eyes that could cut glass.
Mrs. Ashworth,
He said in that calm, measured tone that makes people suddenly remember forgotten parking tickets.
interesting timing.
The clipboard slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting my hardwood floor with a sharp crack. You could smell the panic mixing with her expensive perfume. "This is private HOA business," she said, trying to recover her authority. She had no idea that walking through my door would be the biggest mistake of her life. "What would you do if your HOA nightmare took an unexpected turn? Tell me where you're watching from. This gets wild." But let me back up 6 months to when this whole nightmare started. My name's Thomas Brennan, and at 52, I thought I'd finally earned some peace and quiet. After 25 years working cybersecurity for various government agencies, I'd saved enough to retire early and fulfill a lifelong dream, fixing up my grandfather's old fishing cabin. The place sits on Lake Clearwater, Michigan, about an hour north of Grand Rapids. 300 acres of pristine water surrounded by 47 cabins, most dating back to the 1940s when working folks could still afford lakefront property. Every morning I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, watching steam rise off the water while loons called across the glassy surface. The smell of fresh pine boards and the satisfying crunch of gravel under my work boots filled the air as I slowly transformed the place into my permanent home. For the first few months, it was paradise. The community felt like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Kids fishing off docks, neighbors helping each other with boat repairs, Friday night potlucks where Betty Henderson's famous apple pie disappeared faster than free beer at a construction site. Sure, there was an HOA, but it had formed 3 years earlier just to fight off some developer who wanted to buy up the shoreline. Protective, not controlling. Then Vivian Ashworth moved in like a perfectly manicured tornado. Picture your worst nightmare of suburban entitlement. 58 years old, recently divorced, with a blonde bob so rigid it could survive a hurricane. She wore designer athleisure-like armor and carried herself with the particular arrogance of someone who'd never been told no by a retail manager. Within 6 months of moving from her expensive suburb to a quaint lake cottage, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency, promising to bring proper standards to our community. Red flags don't get much redder than that. The trouble started when I decided to rebuild my grandfather's fishing dock. The thing had been there since 1943. Half the neighbors remembered catching bluegill off it as kids. Just a simple wooden platform extending 20 feet into shallow water, weathered gray by decades of Michigan winters. I was pulling up rotted boards, the sweet smell of old cedar mixing with lake water, when Vivian appeared like she'd been summoned by some suburban disturbance in the force. "Excuse me," she said, her designer heels clicking aggressively across my gravel driveway, a sound that would haunt my dreams. "Are you aware that dock requires architectural review approval?" I looked up from my work, wood stain on my hands, sweat dripping down my back. "Ma'am, this dock's been here longer than either of us. My grandfather built it before there was even a road to this lake." Her smile could have frozen hell over. "Well, according to our new community standards, any waterfront structure requires a $500 architectural review fee and board approval. $500 for a dock that existed before she was born." Here's something every property owner needs to know. Pre-existing structures are typically grandfathered under original property rights, and HOAs can't retroactively regulate them without specific legal authority. Always check what actually exists in your recorded covenants, not what someone claims they say. "Show me where that's written in the original covenants," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Oh, it's in our updated bylaws, section 4.7b, if you must know." She produced a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "The board voted unanimously last month. I'll need to review those documents." "Of course. You have 30 days to submit your application and fee or face fines for non-compliance." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Thomas? We'll be watching to ensure full adherence to community standards." The way she said my name made it sound like a disease. That night, I called my neighbor Bill, an 80-year-old retired mechanic who'd lived on the lake since 1967. His gravelly voice crackled through the phone. "Son, That woman's been making up rules faster than a politician makes promises. Half the folks are too scared to fight her. I hung up, knowing this was war. 3 days later, Vivian called an emergency HOA meeting about waterfront violations threatening our community standards. The timing was no accident. 2 p.m. on a Tuesday when most working folks couldn't attend. I showed up to find 12 homeowners crammed into our little community center, half of them clearly Team Vivian. She'd prepared like a prosecutor going after a serial killer. Blown-up photos of my dock project covered an easel, with arrows pointing to structural irregularities and environmental hazards. You'd think I was building a nuclear reactor instead of replacing some old boards. As you can see, Vivian announced, clicking across the linoleum floor in heels that echoed like gunshots, Mr. Brennan has begun unauthorized construction that violates multiple community standards. The smell of her overpowering perfume, something between funeral flowers and industrial cleaner, mixed with the musty air of the old community center, making my eyes water. Mrs. Patterson, a sweet 70-year-old widow, raised her hand tentatively. But Vivian, hasn't that dock been there forever? I remember my late husband fishing there in the 60s. Vivian's smile turned sharp enough to cut glass. What matters, Margaret, is current compliance with current standards. We can't allow sentiment to override safety and property values. That's when she dropped her real bombshell. She'd already filed a formal complaint with the county claiming my dock posed immediate environmental hazards to the lake. County code enforcement would be investigating within the week. The woman hadn't just prepared for this meeting, she'd set a trap. I felt my coffee mug grow warm in my tightening grip as she continued her presentation. Photos, diagrams, a whole PowerPoint about unregulated waterfront development. She'd spent more time preparing this hit job than most lawyers spend on actual cases. The vote was a foregone conclusion. 7 in favor of fining me $2,000 for non-compliance, 5 opposed. Vivian smugly announced I had 30 days to remove the dock or face escalating penalties. As neighbors filed out, old Bill Henderson whispered, "Sorry, son. She's got half these folks convinced you're going to poison the lake." But here's the thing about spending 25 years in government work. You learn that bureaucrats hate one thing more than anything else: being caught operating outside their authority. That evening, I drove to the county recorder's office and requested every document related to our HOA's formation. My old supervisor used to say, "When someone claims they have power over you, make them prove it with the actual paperwork." What I discovered in those dusty files made my blood boil and my heart race at the same time. The original Lake Clearwater Protective Covenants, filed in 1987, mentioned exactly 0 architectural review requirements. The HOA's incorporation papers granted power to maintain common areas and enforce recorded restrictions. Nothing about creating new rules or charging fees. Vivian's Section 4.7b existed only in her imagination. Even better, I remembered from my government contract days that Michigan state law requires 60% of all homeowners, not just meeting attendees, to approve any new restrictions or fees. With 47 households, she'd needed 29 votes. She had 7. The next HOA meeting was packed like a Friday night fish fry. Word had spread about my findings, and folks were curious. I arrived with a briefcase full of official documents and the kind of confidence that comes from holding 4 aces. "Before we discuss dock compliance," I said, standing as she called for old business, "I'd like to clarify our legal authority for architectural review fees." Her face flushed red as I spread county records across the table like a winning poker hand. According to the recorded covenants in Michigan state law, the HOA has no authority to implement architectural review requirements or charge associated fees. The vote to fine me for dock construction was legally invalid. You could hear a pin drop. The satisfying sound of chair legs scraping against linoleum filled the silence as Vivian's supporters shifted uncomfortably, realizing they'd been had. The taste of victory was sweeter than Betty Henderson's apple pie. Bill Henderson's gravelly chuckle broke the tension. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like someone did their homework." The motion to rescind my fine passed 8-3, with several of Vivian's former allies suddenly developing spines. Her perfectly composed mask slipped just enough to reveal the fury underneath, and something else: desperation. "This is far from over, Thomas," she said as the meeting disbanded, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "There are many ways to ensure community compliance." The threat was clear, but I felt pretty good walking to my truck that night. First victory to the good guys. I should have known better. Vivian Ashworth didn't get where she was by accepting defeat gracefully. The next morning, I woke to find a county code enforcement officer standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, and an apologetic expression on his face. "Sorry to bother you, sir, but I received a complaint about potential septic system violations. Anonymous tip claims there's raw sewage runoff affecting the lake. My septic system was brand new, installed to current codes just 6 months earlier. But county regulations required investigation of any environmental complaint, regardless of how bogus it seemed. Game on, Vivian." The code enforcement officer, a tired-looking guy named Dave who clearly didn't want to be there, spent an hour poking around my property with a clipboard and the enthusiasm of someone auditing a tax return. My septic system passed inspection with flying colors, but he was legally obligated to file a report about the anonymous environmental concern. "Look, Mr. Brennan," Dave said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better decades. "Your system's cleaner than most restaurants I inspect. But whoever filed this complaint was very detailed. They knew exactly which regulations to cite, down to the subsection numbers." That's when the light bulb went off brighter than a Christmas tree in Times Square. Vivian hadn't just filed a random complaint. She'd spent hours researching environmental codes like she was studying for the bar exam. The woman was fighting dirty, and she was disturbingly good at it. Over the next week, I started asking casual questions around the community. What I discovered made my stomach churn like bad gas station sushi. Betty Henderson mentioned how strange it was that her tree removal citation came just 2 days after she'd voted against Vivian's new landscaping restrictions. The Martinez family got slapped with excessive noise violations right after their daughter's quinceañera. Apparently, 12-year-old girls laughing by the lake violated some newly invented quiet hours policy. The smell of charcoal smoke and lake breeze filled the air during Friday's impromptu dock gathering as neighbors shared their horror stories. Each tale followed the same sinister pattern. Oppose Vivian. Face mysterious violations that cost real money and real stress. "She's got us all walking on eggshells," whispered Sarah Martinez, glancing around like Vivian might emerge from the cattails with a citation book. "My husband wants to just pay whatever she demands to avoid more trouble." That's exactly what Vivian was counting on. A community too intimidated to fight back. But her next move was so audacious, it left me speechless. At the following week's meeting, she calmly announced she'd appointed herself Lake Water Quality Monitor under state environmental regulations. She'd be conducting random property inspections within 100 feet of the shoreline to ensure environmental compliance. The sheer brass on this woman could have been melted down and used to plate the Capitol dome. "I'll need immediate access to all waterfront properties for comprehensive environmental assessments," she declared, waving around what looked like official paperwork complete with state seals. Michigan environmental law mandates full compliance with monitoring requirements. Here's what 25 years of handling government contracts teaches you. When someone starts throwing around phrases like state law mandates while waving impressive-looking documents, they're usually blowing smoke up your exhaust pipe. Real government authority comes with real paperwork, real signatures, and real consequences for officials who abuse it. So that night, I called the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality directly. "Ma'am," I said to the helpful woman on the phone, "I'm trying to understand HOA authority for environmental inspections under state law." Her laugh was immediate and loud enough to wake sleeping fish. "Sir, HOAs have absolutely zero environmental inspection authority under Michigan law. If someone's claiming state authority for property inspections, they're either completely confused or flat out lying." Bingo. The next morning, Vivian showed up at my door with a clipboard, a professional-grade camera, and the kind of self-righteous smile that makes decent people want to take up bare-knuckle boxing. "Good morning, Thomas. I'm here for your mandatory environmental inspection." I leaned against my doorframe, coffee steam warming my face in the cool morning air, savoring what was about to happen. "Actually, Vivian, I called the state environmental office yesterday. Turns out HOAs have zero inspection authority under Michigan law. Absolutely none. Funny how that works." Her confident smile flickered like a dying light bulb. "Well, our community standards require you to have actual legal authority before demanding entry to private property. Since you don't have any, I'm politely declining your inspection." The transformation was more beautiful than a Michigan sunset. Her face went from confident to confused to absolutely livid in about 3 seconds flat. You could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she realized she'd been caught red-handed making up authority she didn't possess. "You're obstructing official HOA business," she sputtered, her voice rising an octave. "I'm exercising my constitutional property rights. Michigan trespassing laws apply to HOA officials just like everyone else." That sharp intake of breath she made, like a balloon losing air through a pinhole, was worth every moment of this confrontation. "There will be serious consequences for this non-compliance," she threatened, backing toward her Mercedes like a retreating general. "Looking forward to it," I called after her, raising my coffee mug in a mock toast. But Vivian Ashworth didn't become HOA president by accepting defeat gracefully. That evening brought my introduction to her darker side: mailbox smashed to pieces, newly planted landscaping trampled, and an anonymous note promising real trouble for anyone who didn't cooperate with community leadership. Game officially escalated. A week after my mailbox became modern art, Vivian unveiled her masterpiece of financial warfare. She called another emergency meeting to announce a special assessment fee, $3,000 per household for emergency road repairs that needed immediate attention. I drove those roads every day. They were fine. Hell, they were better than fine. The county had repaved them just 2 years earlier with federal rural development funds. But there was Vivian, standing behind her easel like a twisted Bob Ross painting dollar signs instead of happy little trees, pointing to photos of critical infrastructure failures that looked suspiciously like normal wear and tear. A tiny pothole here, some minor gravel displacement there, nothing that required $3,000 per family to fix. "As you can see," she announced to the packed community center, "these dangerous conditions pose immediate liability risks to our association." The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps as she flipped through her presentation, filling the musty air with that particular smell of old buildings and fresh desperation. The real kicker? She'd already lined up contractors to handle the emergency repairs. Guess whose business associates got the no-bid contracts? Her ex-husband's construction company was suddenly qualified to handle specialized lakefront infrastructure restoration at premium rates. But wait, there's more. She tagged me with an additional $1,000 legal compliance fee for my pattern of obstruction to legitimate HOA business. Apparently, knowing my actual property rights made me a legal hazard to community harmony. Mrs. Patterson raised a shaky hand. "Vivian, dear, I'm on a fixed income. $3,000 is my grocery money for 6 months. I understand the hardship, Margaret, but property ownership comes with responsibilities. We can arrange a payment plan with reasonable interest rates." She was going to charge elderly neighbors interest on made-up fees. The woman had the moral compass of a used car salesman during a hurricane. That night, I did what any former government contractor would do when faced with suspicious financial activity. I requested to examine the HOA's books. Back in my federal days, my supervisor always said, "When someone's moving money around like a shell game, make them show you where the P actually is." And what I found in those manila folders was more beautiful than a perfectly organized evidence file. Over 18 months, Vivian had orchestrated $47,000 in emergency expenditures that vanished faster than free donuts at a police station. Her real estate company was listed as consulting contractor for mysterious services that somehow required $800 monthly payments. The emergency road work from 6 months earlier? Paid to her ex-husband's construction company for double the typical rate. Every manufactured crisis somehow required expensive solutions that benefited Vivian's network of recently divorced professional friends looking for easy money. But here's where it got interesting. I cross-referenced the business registrations for her contractors and discovered half of them were shell companies registered to P.O. boxes. The woman wasn't just stealing, she was running a sophisticated money laundering operation through HOA accounts. During Friday's dock gathering, I shared my findings with neighbors brave enough to show up. The evening air carried the scent of grilling burgers and simmering rage as the truth sank in. "She's been stealing from us this whole time," Betty Henderson said, her voice shaking with more anger than her arthritis. "My $8,000 tree removal went straight into her pocket." Young Tom Martinez clenched his beer can hard enough to dent it. "That noise violation cost us money we couldn't afford. Our daughter asked why we couldn't have birthday parties anymore." That's when Vivian made her most desperate move yet. The following Tuesday, she called police claiming I'd threatened her during official HOA business. The officer who took her report looked about as convinced as a vegetarian at a rib festival, but procedure required documenting her soap opera performance. Then she escalated to a restraining order request, complete with fabricated incidents that would have impressed a screenwriter. Fortunately, judges see vindictive neighbors often enough to spot obvious harassment. Her request was dismissed faster than a bad Tinder profile. But the real surprise came when I noticed the same silver sedan parked on our quiet lake road multiple times over 2 weeks. Always someone behind the wheel, always watching my property through binoculars, always driving away when I approached. Vivian had hired private surveillance. That evening, I made a phone call that would change everything. My old colleague Jake from the cybersecurity division owed me a favor from a contractor vetting project we'd worked on together. He ran the license plate through his contacts and discovered something fascinating. The PI she'd hired had a criminal background and was operating without a license. Photographing a federal contractor's home during classified work periods potentially violated several federal statutes I was intimately familiar with. I sat on my dock that night listening to loons call across the dark water and smiled for the first time in weeks. Vivian had just made the biggest mistake of her criminal career. She'd inadvertently committed a federal crime while targeting someone who knew exactly which federal agents to call. Here's what Vivian didn't know about Thomas Brennan. My 25 years in cybersecurity for various government agencies wasn't just corporate consulting. I'd spent the last decade specializing in contractor vetting and financial crimes investigation for some very serious federal departments, the kind that don't appreciate domestic terrorism or financial fraud against government programs. My current retirement consulting wasn't just any contract work. I was helping the FBI's cybercrimes unit develop new protocols for vetting government contractors. The sweet irony? While Vivian was busy terrorizing me, I was literally working for the people who investigate financial crimes like hers. That silver sedan watching my house, the unlicensed PI photographing a federal contractor's home office while I handled classified materials. In our post-9/11 world, that kind of surveillance triggers automatic federal interest faster than a free buffet empties at a truckers' convention. But the real bombshell was buried in Vivian's financial records like a landmine waiting for the right footstep. As I dug deeper into her shell company scheme, cross-referencing account numbers and transaction dates, I discovered something that made my coffee taste like liquid justice. Some of the HOA funds she'd been stealing came from federal flood insurance reimbursements our community had received after the heavy storms 2 years ago. The emergency road repairs she kept manufacturing, half that money was supposed to come from FEMA disaster relief funds distributed to our HOA for legitimate storm damage repairs. I sat there in my home office, the smell of lake breeze drifting through open windows, staring at bank records that proved Vivian wasn't just running a local embezzlement scheme. She was stealing federal disaster relief money. The woman had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. Federal jurisdiction kicked in automatically under multiple statutes I knew by heart: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and theft of federal funds. Each charge carried a potential 20-year sentence, and federal judges don't have much sympathy for people who steal disaster relief money from hurricane victims. The person she thought was some retired nobody had actually been systematically robbed by someone dumb enough to steal from the federal government while harassing a federal contractor under active security clearance. I couldn't have written a more perfect setup if I'd been directing a movie. That evening, I reviewed everything through my federal crimes lens instead of my angry neighbor perspective. The structured financial transactions designed to avoid detection, the shell companies registered across state lines, the wire transfers moving money between fraudulent accounts. This wasn't amateur hour theft. This was organized financial crime that crossed federal jurisdictional boundaries like a drunk driver crosses lane markers. And the harassment campaign against me? Through federal eyes, that looked like witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, especially once prosecutors realized their target was a government contractor with active security clearance. The next morning, I made a call that felt both casual and earth-shaking. My current FBI contact, Director Sarah Rory, was someone I'd worked with on several contractor security projects. We had a standing monthly consultation scheduled anyway, but I moved it up. "Sarah, I've got an interesting situation about HOA financial crimes and federal jurisdiction," I said, choosing my words carefully. Her laugh was immediate. "Marcus, you know there's no such thing as hypothetical questions when federal contractors call about financial crimes." I walked her through Vivian's scheme, documenting how federal disaster money had been diverted through fraudulent contracts. Rory's expertise made her the perfect person to assess federal interest in what had started as a petty neighborhood dispute. How much federal money? She asked, already taking notes. Conservatively, $90,000 in FEMA and rural development funds. Marcus, this just became a federal case. We scheduled a formal consultation for the following Tuesday at my house. Routine contractor business that would accidentally coincide with Vivian's next power play. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected directions. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive, and in my case, grateful to be orchestrating the downfall of a neighborhood tyrant who'd made the fatal mistake of stealing federal disaster money. I had exactly 6 hours to prepare for what would either be the most satisfying afternoon of my retirement or the beginning of a federal case that would send Vivian to prison. First order of business, organizing evidence like I was preparing to brief the president on national security threats. I spread financial documents across my dining room table in chronological order, each fraudulent transaction highlighted in colors that would make a kindergarten teacher jealous. Bank statements showing shell company deposits, invoices for work that existed only in Vivian's imagination, wire transfer records that painted a clearer picture of systematic theft than fingerprints on a murder weapon. My old supervisor used to say, "Evidence is like a good bourbon. It needs age, clarity, and the ability to knock people on their ass when they taste it." These documents had all three qualities in spades. Director Rory arrived at 1 p.m. sharp, bringing financial crimes specialist Rodriguez, a woman who could spot money laundering patterns like a hawk spotting field mice from 1,000 feet up. They set up in my home office with the professional efficiency of surgeons preparing for a complex operation. "Walk us through the timeline," Rory said, opening her briefcase and activating recording equipment. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my office windows caught the metallic surfaces of her federal badge, casting tiny rainbows across the financial evidence spread before us. "Started small," I explained, pointing to the earliest bank records. 500 here for fake consulting, 800 there for inflated maintenance. But once she realized nobody was paying attention, she got greedier than a politician in an election year. Rodriguez examined the shell company registrations with the laser focus of someone reading the most fascinating mystery novel ever written. These entities were created specifically to launder HOA funds. Look at this timing. Each company established just weeks before receiving fraudulent payments. Here's something every community needs to understand. Federal financial crimes require federal evidence standards. Every document must be authenticated, every transaction verified through official banking records, every criminal pattern documented with precision that would impress a Swiss watchmaker. Local police can work with copies and verbal testimony, but federal prosecutors need originals and unbroken chains of custody. This FEMA money theft triggers mandatory minimums, Rory noted, reviewing disaster relief diversions with the grim satisfaction of someone calculating a mortgage payment for someone else's house. Federal judges don't negotiate on disaster fund theft. 4 to 6 years minimum, probably 8 with money laundering enhancements. While they analyzed financial evidence, I prepared the psychological trap. I'd already spread rumors through our community gossip network, more efficient than Wi-Fi and twice as reliable, that I was finally capitulating. Paying all fines, removing my dock, maybe even abandoning the lake entirely. The story was specifically designed to trigger Vivian's need for a final victory lap. Nothing brings out a bully's arrogance quite like the smell of total surrender, mixed with the opportunity to gloat publicly. Betty Henderson had helpfully mentioned seeing moving trucks at my property. Complete fiction that would hopefully convince Vivian this was her moment of ultimate triumph. The woman couldn't resist twisting the knife when she thought she'd won. Rodriguez set up portable document scanning equipment to create official evidence chains of custody. The mechanical whir of federal-grade scanners mixed with the smell of hot electronics and the faint scent of justice being served at exactly the right temperature. "Marcus, you understand this isn't entrapment," Rory clarified as documents fed through authentication scanners. Her crimes were already committed. This meeting serves legitimate law enforcement purposes regardless of any theatrical elements. But we all knew what was really happening. Sometimes justice needs a little dramatic assistance to achieve maximum community impact. The timing had to be perfect. Federal investigations require precise documentation, but neighborhood justice demands perfect staging. We'd scheduled evidence review for 2 p.m., knowing Vivian typically conducted her intimidation patrol rounds between 2:30 and 3 p.m. on Tuesdays, especially after real estate showings when her confidence was highest. I positioned security cameras to document any harassment or threats, my phone ready to record admissions or intimidation attempts. The stage was set for someone who'd spent months terrorizing neighbors to finally meet consequences with federal badges attached. The afternoon air carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter as my watch showed 2:45 p.m. Right on schedule, Vivian's Mercedes appeared, making its predatory circuit around the lake like a shark circling wounded swimmers. "Showtime," I murmured to Rory and Rodriguez, who looked up from their document review with the anticipation of federal agents about to watch justice unfold in real time. Car doors slammed in my driveway with unnecessary aggression, Vivian's calling card when she meant business. Through my office window, we watched her approach with clipboard camera and 2 male associates brought specifically for intimidation value. "Mrs. Ashworth appears to be conducting official business," Rodriguez observed with federal deadpan delivery. Chen smiled like someone about to watch the perfect end to a perfectly built case. The taste of anticipation was better than aged whiskey. While I was setting my federal trap, Vivian was busy conducting her own victory lap around the community like a general celebrating before the battle was actually won. Word traveled through our lake neighborhood faster than gossip at a church social. Marcus Brennan was finally broken, finally ready to surrender his property and disappear. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening to discuss transition arrangements for the Brennan property. The agenda, which somehow appeared in every mailbox by morning, included gems like converting lakefront cabin to exclusive HOA clubhouse and establishing new revenue streams through strategic property acquisition. The woman wasn't just planning to steal my house, she was already decorating it in her mind. Betty Henderson called Tuesday morning with intelligence from the Senior Citizens Coffee Reconnaissance Network. "Marcus, dear, Vivian's been making calls to her real estate contacts about development opportunities on your lot. She's telling people you're moving to Arizona because the stress of community conflict damaged your health." Arizona. I'd never mentioned Arizona. I'd never even visited Arizona. But Vivian's overconfidence was making her sloppy, and sloppy criminals are like drunk drivers. They leave evidence everywhere they go. She began bragging to anyone within earshot about her successful resolution of the community's problem resident. At Murphy's Marina, she told Frank Murphy loud enough for half the store to hear, "Some people just don't understand how communities work, but persistence and proper leadership always triumph." The smell of engine oil and lake water couldn't quite mask the stench of her arrogance. Frank, who'd been selling bait to my grandfather since the 1960s, called me that evening with disgust dripping from his gravelly voice. "Marcus, that woman's claiming she's got political connections for fast-track zoning changes on your property. Says it'll be commercial development that benefits everyone." Political connections for commercial zoning. The criminal enterprise kept expanding. Tuesday evening brought her masterstroke of overconfidence, a celebration party at her lakefront mansion. Wine flowed, laughter echoed across the water, and according to Sarah Martinez, who lived close enough to hear everything, Vivian spent the evening outlining her grand plans. She was describing how she'd convert your cabin into regional HOA headquarters, where she could host leadership seminars for other communities, Sarah reported Wednesday morning. "Marcus, she's planning to use stolen money to create a for-profit training business in your grandfather's house." The woman had evolved from simple theft to full-scale racketeering. She wasn't just stealing from us, she was planning to franchise her criminal model to other communities. Wednesday afternoon brought unexpected visitors to my door. 2 men in dark suits with federal badges, but not FBI. Department of Homeland Security, Counterintelligence Division. "Mr. Brennan," Agent Walsh said with professional courtesy that made my security clearance instincts snap to attention, "We've been monitoring unauthorized surveillance of cleared contractors. Your situation has triggered some automatic protocols." Apparently, when unlicensed private investigators photograph federal contractors' homes during classified work periods, multiple agencies start paying very close attention. Vivian's harassment campaign had just attracted counterintelligence scrutiny. "Sir, we need to assess whether this surveillance poses broader security risks to ongoing federal projects," Walsh explained, taking detailed notes about timing, equipment, and potential compromise of sensitive information. That's when I realized Vivian had made her biggest mistake yet. What she thought was simple neighborhood harassment had accidentally triggered national security protocols. Her little power trip had just crossed into federal counterintelligence territory. Agents, I'm scheduled to brief FBI Director Rory tomorrow afternoon about related financial crimes. Perhaps you'd like to coordinate your security assessment with their investigation? Walsh's eyebrows raised slightly, the federal equivalent of jumping up and down with excitement. Yes, sir. We'd very much like to coordinate. Unauthorized surveillance of cleared contractors during active financial crimes investigations creates interesting jurisdictional opportunities. Thursday morning brought Vivian's final act of overconfidence. She appeared at my front door, not the office, the front door, carrying a leather folder and wearing the kind of smile that belongs in psychological thrillers. Good morning, Thomas. I have resignation papers for you to sign. Resignation papers. She'd actually had legal documents prepared transferring my property to community management for collective benefit. The papers included language about voluntary departure due to community incompatibility and acknowledgement of regulatory compliance failures. I invited her into my living room, where the aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the electricity of someone about to step on a landmine they'd constructed with their own hands. These documents formalize your departure and ensure smooth transition of your lakefront property to proper community oversight, she explained, spreading papers across my coffee table like she was closing the real estate deal of the century. The woman had brought fake legal documents to steal my house on the same day federal agents were arriving to arrest her for stealing federal money. My phone buzzed with a text from Director Rory. Running 10 minutes early. The trap was about to spring. Director Rory and Specialist Rodriguez arrived at exactly 1:47 p.m., their unmarked sedan pulling into my driveway with the quiet authority that only federal vehicles possess. I watched through my living room window as Vivian's eyes tracked their approach, her confident smile flickering like a candle in a hurricane. Marcus, who are these people? She asked, her voice carrying just a hint of nervousness as she gathered her fake legal documents closer to her chest. Government consultation, I said casually, refilling my coffee cup. Routine contractor business. They'll probably be here for a couple hours reviewing classified projects. The word classified made her go pale around the edges. Good. Chen knocked with professional courtesy, 3 measured raps that announced federal authority without demanding it. I let them in through the front door, making sure Vivian got a clear view of their credentials and serious expressions. Mr. Brennan, Rory said formally, we're here for the cybersecurity consultation we discussed. I hope we're not interrupting anything important. Actually, I replied, Mrs. Ashworth was just presenting some HOA documents that might interest you. She's been conducting quite a comprehensive financial operation in our community. Rodriguez's trained eye immediately assessed the scene. Middle-aged woman with legal papers, obvious tension, and the particular atmosphere that surrounds people caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. Her hand moved subtly toward her briefcase. Mrs. Ashworth, Rory said with the calm professionalism that makes guilty people confess things they hadn't planned to confess. We've been reviewing some interesting financial patterns in your HOA operations. Perhaps you'd like to join our discussion? The color drained from Vivian's face faster than bathwater down a drain. She clutched her fake resignation papers like a security blanket, her perfectly manicured fingers leaving wrinkles in the expensive paper. This is private HOA business, she stammered, backing toward my front door. I should go. Actually, Rodriguez said, settling into my armchair with the casual authority of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times. We'd prefer if you stayed. We have some questions about federal disaster relief funds and their creative applications in your community. That's when Vivian made her fatal mistake. Instead of calling a lawyer or simply leaving, she decided to double down on her authority play. I don't know what you think you've discovered, she said, her voice gaining strength as her suburban entitlement overrode her common sense. But I am the duly elected president of this HOA, and I have full authority to manage community resources as I see fit. The silence that followed was more beautiful than a Mozart symphony. Rory and Rodriguez exchanged the kind of look that federal agents share when suspects voluntarily confess to federal crimes without being asked. Mrs. Ashworth, Rory said slowly, pulling out a digital recorder and placing it on my coffee table next to Vivian's fake documents. Are you stating that you have authority to redirect federal disaster relief funds to personal accounts? I never said anything about personal accounts, Vivian snapped, then immediately realized she'd just confirmed knowledge of the federal funds. Rodriguez opened her briefcase and began spreading bank records across my coffee table like a poker player showing a royal flush. These are wire transfer records showing FEMA disaster relief money being diverted to shell companies registered in your name. Would you like to explain how community disaster relief became personal income? The transformation was incredible to watch. Vivian went from suburban HOA tyrant to cornered criminal in about 30 seconds. Her breathing became shallow, her hands shook, and that perfectly styled blonde bob started showing stress sweat around the edges. Those transactions were administrative fees, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of my air conditioning. Administrative fees of $89,000? Rory asked, with the tone of someone who already knew the answer. Mrs. Ashworth, federal disaster relief fraud carries mandatory minimum sentences. We're not talking about HOA disputes anymore. That's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Murphy's Marina, and I answered on speaker without thinking. Marcus, Frank Murphy's gravelly voice filled my living room. You need to know, that HOA woman was just here bragging to customers about how she's going to turn your place into some kind of regional training center, says she's got enough money from community improvements to franchise the operation to other lakes. The silence after Frank hung up was deafening. Vivian had just been caught on record discussing using stolen federal money for commercial expansion plans. Chen looked at Rodriguez, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Ashworth, I think we need to have a more formal conversation about your federal crimes. I want a lawyer, Vivian whispered, finally understanding that her months of harassment had led her directly into a federal trap. That's probably wise, Rodriguez said, pulling out handcuffs with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. You're going to need a very good one. The sweet smell of justice filled my living room as backup agents arrived to process the scene. What happened next was better than any movie I'd ever seen, and I had front row seats to the whole spectacular show. Rodriguez was just reaching for her handcuffs when Vivian did something that surprised even seasoned federal agents. She bolted. Not toward the door like a smart criminal, but deeper into my house, clutching those fake resignation papers like they were a get-out-of-jail-free card. Mrs. Ashworth, Rory called sharply, stop where you are. But panic makes people stupid, and Vivian was nothing if not panicked. She ran straight through my living room, through my kitchen, and burst out my back door onto the deck overlooking the lake, directly into the view of about 30 neighbors who'd gathered to watch the government meeting they'd been whispering about all week. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if I'd choreographed it myself. Betty Henderson was watering her garden 50 feet away. The Martinez family was building a dock at their shoreline. Tom Wilson was mowing his lawn close enough to hear every word. Half the lake community was within shouting distance when Vivian Ashworth emerged onto my deck, followed immediately by 2 federal agents with badges clearly visible. This is harassment, she screamed across the water, her voice carrying perfectly in the still afternoon air. I am the legally elected president of this HOA, and I will not be intimidated by some retired government contractor. Chen stepped onto my deck with professional calm, her FBI credentials gleaming in the sunlight. Mrs. Ashworth, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and theft of federal disaster relief funds. The sound that went up from the gathered neighbors was like a stadium crowd watching their team score the winning touchdown. 30 voices gasping, shouting, and cheering as the woman who'd terrorized them for months finally faced consequences. You have the right to remain silent, Rodriguez continued, approaching Vivian with handcuffs ready. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. But Vivian wasn't done digging her own grave. This is all his fault, she shrieked, pointing at me with a shaking finger. Marcus Brennan has been obstructing legitimate HOA business from the beginning. He refuses to follow community standards. Community standards like stealing $89,000 in federal disaster money? Rory asked loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle lapping of lake water against my dock and the distant sound of someone applauding. Old Bill Henderson, clapping slowly from his yard across the cove. Then Sarah Martinez joined in. Then Betty Henderson. Then Tom Wilson. Within 30 seconds, the entire lakefront was erupting in applause as federal agents handcuffed the woman who'd made their lives miserable. This isn't over, Vivian shouted as Rodriguez guided her toward my house. I have connections. I have lawyers. I'll fight this. That's when Rodriguez delivered the line that would become legendary in our community. Ma'am, your connections can't help you with federal crimes, and your lawyers are going to be very expensive. You should have thought about that before you decided to steal disaster relief money from hurricane victims. The walk from my back deck to the federal vehicles became a perp walk witnessed by half the lake community. Neighbors emerged from their houses like prairie dogs after a thunderstorm, watching in amazement as the woman who'd wielded HOA regulations like a weapon finally met consequences she couldn't manipulate. Frank Murphy drove up just as they were loading Vivian into the federal vehicle, his boat trailer still attached to his pickup truck. "Well, I'll be damned," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like that woman finally bit off more than she could chew." The local news van arrived just as the federal cars were pulling away. Someone had tipped them off about federal arrests at Lake Clearwater. Channel 8's crime reporter got perfect footage of Vivian in handcuffs being driven away from the lake she'd tried to control. But the real victory came when Betty Henderson walked over to me, tears in her eyes, and said loud enough for everyone gathered to hear, "Marcus, thank you for having the courage to stand up to her when the rest of us were too scared." "She made one big mistake, Betty," I replied, looking around at neighbors who were finally free to enjoy their own community again. "She should have stopped at harassment instead of stealing federal money." Tom Martinez laughed from his dock where his kids were already jumping back into the lake water. "Guess she never learned that some fights you just can't win." As the crowd dispersed and normal lake life resumed for the first time in months, I sat on my grandfather's rebuilt dock with a beer and watched the sun begin to set over water that finally felt peaceful again. Sometimes justice comes with handcuffs and federal charges. Sometimes it comes with the sound of children laughing by the lake again. 6 months later, Lake Clearwater felt like a completely different place, and Vivian Ashworth was exactly where she belonged. The federal case moved faster than anyone expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft of federal disaster funds, Vivian's expensive lawyers advised her to take the plea deal. 4 years in federal prison, full restitution of $127,000 to the community, and permanent prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership role nationwide. Her lakefront mansion went up for sale to pay restitution, bought by a young couple from Grand Rapids who actually wanted to be part of our community instead of ruling it. The irony was perfect. The house Vivian had used as her criminal headquarters became home to people who brought fresh-baked cookies to HOA meetings. The emergency HOA meeting to elect new leadership was standing room only, and for the first time in years, people were actually excited to participate. Betty Henderson was elected president by unanimous vote, with a platform of transparency, kindness, and absolutely no made-up fees. The new bylaws required financial audits, recorded meetings, and majority homeowner approval for any expenditure over $500. Every fraudulent fee Vivian had imposed was immediately reversed and refunded with interest. My $4,000 in forced payments came back as a check that I promptly donated to the new Lake Clearwater Community Improvement Fund. Because unlike some people, I actually cared about improving our neighborhood. The federal restitution money transformed our community in ways Vivian never intended. We established the Lake Clearwater Scholarship Fund for local kids pursuing careers in criminal justice, because apparently our little lake had produced quite a few people interested in fighting financial crimes. The environmental conservation project she'd pretended to care about actually happened, funded by her stolen money and managed by people who understood the difference between conservation and embezzlement. Frank Murphy started hosting federal justice fish fries every Friday evening at the marina, where neighbors gathered to share stories and celebrate living in a community where bullies eventually face consequences. The smell of fried bluegill and the sound of genuine laughter replaced the tension and fear that had poisoned our lake for too long. My grandfather's dock became something of a community landmark. Kids learned to fish from it, neighbors stopped by for evening conversations, and visiting federal agents occasionally enjoyed coffee there while wrapping up final case details. Director Rory visited twice more, once for follow-up interviews and once just to enjoy the peaceful lake where justice had been served with a side of community healing. The best part? Children playing freely in the lake again without fear of noise violations. The Martinez family threw their daughter a proper birthday party, complete with squealing, laughing kids and 0 harassment citations. Betty Henderson planted flowers without worrying about landscape compliance fees. Tom Wilson played his radio while working in the yard without glancing nervously at Vivian's former house. Our community garden flourished where Vivian's intimidation tactics once created fear. Neighbors collaborated on genuine improvements instead of hiding from manufactured violations. The annual Lake Freedom Festival, our celebration of democratic victory over tyranny, became a tradition that brought families together instead of driving them apart. I completed my cabin renovation exactly as planned, turning it into the retirement home my grandfather would have loved. My consulting work continued, with occasional visits from federal colleagues who'd heard about the HOA embezzlement case solved by a contractor with good record-keeping skills. Turns out, standing up to financial criminals makes you popular in certain government circles. The local news story about our case went viral nationwide. How one retiree stopped an HOA tyrant with federal help, inspiring other communities to examine their own HOA finances more carefully. The FBI started using our case as a training example for financial crimes investigators, and several states introduced stricter HOA oversight legislation. But the real victory wasn't the arrests or the restitution money. It was sitting on my dock every morning, drinking coffee in a community where neighbors helped each other instead of fearing petty tyrants, where kids could be kids, where elderly residents felt safe in their own homes, and where democracy worked the way it was supposed to. Sometimes the best revenge is simply outlasting the people who try to break you. Sometimes justice comes with federal badges and prison sentences, and sometimes, if you're really lucky, it comes with the sound of children laughing by the water where your grandfather once taught you to fish.
So that's how Thomas Brennan went from being harassed by his HOA president to watching her get arrested by the FBI in his own living room, 4 years in federal prison for stealing $89,000 in disaster relief money. Here's what gets me about this story. Vivian as Wood represents something we see everywhere: people who mistake authority for the right to abuse others. Thomas could have just paid more bus fees and moved on. Most of us would have, but every time we pay the bully, we're funding the next victim. What Thomas understood was that bullies only stop when someone with more authority makes them stop. And sometimes that authority comes from places they never expected. I guarantee you're thinking about your own neighborhood right now. That HOA board member who treats meetings like their personal kingdom. That neighbor who weaponized city ordinance. Here's my question. When you see that happening, what do? Keep your head down or start documenting like Thomas did? If this story fired you up, then subscribe because you've got dozens more about ordinary people pitting corruption. Drop a comment about the worst HOA abuse you've witnessed. Remember, bullies only win when good people stay quiet. Don't stay quiet.